Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Ladies and gentlemen, today on Antidote, episode 11, it is all about the big, bad 1970s. So smoke them if you got them. Our guest in the studio, my good friend, he is a journalist, he is a Renaissance man, he is a pop culture historian, he's a righteous dude. He is the author of two very popular books on baseball in the 1970s. His most recent book is this, Stars and Strikes, Baseball and America in the Bicentennial Summer of 1976. Dan Epstein.
Michael.
Good to see you, my brother.
Good to see you too, man.
Thanks for coming by.
Oh, my pleasure. Oh, always a pleasure to rap about the 1970s with you.
Hey, man, it's funny, you and I were talking. The 70s, they cast a long shadow. Some people talk about the 70s, that they were vapid or whatever, but there was a lot of great stuff. I love the 70s.
It's a very complex decade. There is, in some ways, the 60s didn't really end until, Altamont or
right.
Kent State, maybe. And, but you look at just even at the music at the beginning of the 70s and at the end, or how baseball progresses from 1970 to 1979. It's like two entirely different worlds in that span.
We start out, in the book, you have this excellent paragraph that, if you don't mind, I would like for you to read, because it's one of my favorite paragraphs that I encountered. And it's this one here, because it basically says what you just said.
But better.
Well, but it's
going to require some reading glasses.
It leads to a place that I want to go with the overall arc of the.
Right here?
Yes.
Okay. While much of the bicentennial merchandising and marketing was clearly profit-motivated, R&B poet Gil Scott-Heron wasn't just making a facetious play on words when he referred to the nation's 200th birthday celebration as the bicentennial in his poem Bicentennial Blues. The bicentennial buzz also served as a star-spangled salve for a severely bruised national psyche. The Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, rising oil prices, and declining U.S. manufacturing, and a struggling economy had all done considerable damage to America's collective self-esteem. No longer able to comfortably embrace their inner John Wayne in the wake of a disastrous war that had seriously diminished the country's moral credibility in the eyes of the world, U.S. citizens could still embrace their inner Ben Franklin, celebrate the intelligence, ingenuity, and fortitude of the Founding Fathers, and wax nostalgic for a war, the American Revolution, in which Americans were not only the victors, but also the underdogs and indisputable good guys.
Who doesn't want to be the good guy for a change?
Everybody wants to be the good guy.
So that was what was happening in 76. Let's back up a little bit, because both of your books have to do with baseball in the 70s. And this weekend, when I was boning up on my 70s baseball, I watched this documentary. A documentary. It's about this man, Doc Ellis. Dan, tell me who Doc Ellis is and why he's so legendary.
Doc Ellis was a very good pitcher, pitched primarily for the Pittsburgh Pirates in the 1970s, but also for the Yankees and the Oakland A's and the Texas Rangers. He's legendary now because he is, as far as we know, the only Major League ball player to pitch a no-hitter while tripping on LSD. And this is, this was not known at the time. This happened in 1970, and in his book, he wrote a great book with the poet laureate Donald Hall called Doc Ellis in the Country of Baseball. And in that book, which originally came out in 1976, he said that he was, hungover, still buzzed from drinking screwdrivers. And after he retired, it came out that actually he was on acid. And Doc was quite the partier, as several other players of his era were. And he dropped acid with some friends, forgot that he was pitching, and made it to the ballpark and pitched an incredible game, even though he wasn't really aware of what was happening around him, and really kind of had to concentrate on the rainbow path that led from the pitcher's mound to the catcher's mitt. And as long as he put the ball down that path, he was golden.
Pitching a no-hitter would be difficult enough. Pitching it high on LSD, one of the unsung events of the 1970s.
Well, of any era. I mean, I really believe that may be the greatest athletic feat of all time.
Exactly. This is terrible, but I was thinking, you know what? I think I might like to see more sporting events conducted on acid, and not me, but them. But,
right. This is see what happens. But what's interesting about Doc, and what's interesting about the the documentary that you're talking about, which I'm also a contributor to. There was so much more to him than that. I mean, that's really like where the legend of Doc Ellis starts. But he was a really kind of unusual for his era and for his line of work. He was a very intelligent, very curious individual, and he was a partier, yes, but he was always interested in other philosophies. He wore a Star of David and a chai for a while because he was very interested in Judaism, and wound up after he kind of dealt with his own demons and kicked the booze and drugs, wound up becoming a very well-loved drug counselor, especially working with prisoners in the California penal system. Really, people really respected him for his expertise, but also he was a very, very no bullshit kind of guy, and that really came across, both in his pitching and his later work. I mean, it was clearly not adverse to having a good time as clowning around with Chuck Mangione before a Yankees game. That's pretty much a none more '70s photo right there.
Right. I was very impressed with Doc Ellis. I must admit to the audience, I didn't follow baseball that much. What I remember about the '70s, Oakland A's, Cincinnati Reds, Johnny Bench, Vida Blue. So I had to bone up a little bit on '70s baseball. But Doc Ellis, this documentary, I encourage everyone to not only buy Dan's books, but also to watch this documentary, because I was deeply moved by it. By the end, he was very honest about his travails with drugs and alcohol and the relationships that went awry as a result of his issues with those substances. And, he came out on top, man.
Yeah, he did. It's tragic that he died so young, because of liver cancer. But really, there's an example of a guy who really made the most of his time here, and didn't always make the right decisions, but he definitely left the world a better place than he came into it, and that's not something you can say about a lot of athletes.
Absolutely. He was very honest about his use of amphetamines in the '70s. He called them greenies.
Greenies, yeah.
What I was wondering is, clearly drugs and professional sports are not mutually exclusive. And I guess my question is, do you think it was as prevalent as he kind of made it feel like?
Oh, absolutely. I think pretty much 90% of the players in the 1970s took greenies, took amphetamines of some sort. And it was something that was not really frowned upon by most teams and most trainers on the teams. It's just like, in a lot of there's stories that in a lot of clubhouses they had big jars full of the stuff that you're playing this long season, a lot of day games. You had to go out there every day and get pumped up, and after a certain amount of time, your adrenaline glands just aren't firing like they like you would think, okay, you walk out on a big league diamond, you get pumped up. After a while, you need some help, and especially with all the traveling, and then of course a lot of these guys were partying, at night as well. So Jim Bouton in his book Ball 4 was really the first athlete to talk about that.
And he caught a lot of hell about that.
He got a lot of crap for it, and in fact, the baseball commissioner tried to get him to publicly apologize and claim that it was all made up. And Pete Rose got in a lot of trouble in the '70s for talking about, in a Playboy interview in I think '79, talked about using greenies, and people were quite unhappy with that. But it was a fact of life in the majors, and I think in a lot of ways it was even more prevalent than steroids became later, because it was sort of, amphetamines were part of American culture. Since World War II. They gave them to soldiers, they gave them to people on the production lines to keep going. They gave them to housewives to, that's
the Rolling Stones song.
Right, yeah, Mother's Little Helper. So it's interesting to me that, I see steroids as essentially part of the same issue.
I would agree.
Where it's just like, this is stuff to help you perform. Whether or not it actually helps you perform is debatable, but that in your mind it helps you recover quicker from game to game. Maybe it makes you stronger. Maybe it allows you to do things that you couldn't do without them. There's still a lot of controversy about that. But what's interesting to me is how people love to look back at the '70s and look back at players like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and go like, oh, the game was so much purer then. Well, these guys were taking amphetamines, but they weren't taking roids. But
Right.
So I think it has something to do with that. Amphetamines are, even to this day, you can get Sudafed or whatever, and it's pretty easy to obtain some kind of low grade speed and
Sure.
incorporate that into your existence, even tons of caffeine or whatever. But steroids, it's more like a mad scientist thing, especially when you think about all the stuff about Alex Rodriguez, and he would have a gel cap to take at this time of the game, and then a shot, and all this kind of is like really complex and deep, and not just something that you could just pop a pill and go.
Right. Well, you talk about that. You said that the game changed in the '80s, and you kind of mentioned that you thought it didn't change for the positive. You bring up the Pittsburgh drug trials, but I don't want to focus entirely on the drugs. So, hey man, it was the '70s. People were partying. That's part of what makes the '70s so wild
70s.
and woolly. But one of the things I wanted to talk about also, for people who don't know that much about baseball, there was some nutty stuff going on in the '70s. It's like the owners that you talk about, they're trying to get people out to the ball field. And it's the '70s. It's before political correctness is kicked in. It's before, we're scared to be ourselves. Tell me about some of these things they did, because, the Atlanta Braves had a thing called headlock and wedlock.
This was in 1976. This was, you talk about these kind of insane promotions. Ted Turner, Braves owner, who bought the team at the beginning of 1976, was one of the guys really responsible for pushing, upping the ante on the promotional game. Bill Veeck, who also bought the White Sox in 1976 and kind of came back to the game, was legendary for this kind of thing. And Charlie Finley, who owned the A's, also, had a flair for promotions. But Ted kind of took it to another level. And his TV station, WTCG, had a deal with Georgia Championship Wrestling. Like that was, along with the Braves, that was their big client.
Wrestling.
And so he booked a Georgia Championship Wrestling night for, after a game at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. And his promotions team, which had been, he told them like, come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. The crazier, the better. They came up with a home plate wedding promotion where, they would get couples who were getting married to volunteer to be married at home plate after the game. And they wound up double booking the wrestling and the home plate wedding night, for the same game. So this guy named Bob Hope, who was the Braves PR director, no relation to the comedian, he came up with a brilliant idea of fusing the two, so it was headlock and wedlock night. So before the game, 9 couples got married at home plate, and the players from both teams formed sort of an archway with their bats, and the couples came down, were all married together at home plate. Then the game was played, the Braves beat the Mets, and then after it was 4 bouts of no-holds-barred Georgia Championship Wrestling action, including Mr. Wrestling 2 and Abdullah the Butcher. So, fans got their money's worth then.
Absolutely. How glorious is that? I read, was it the Braves also who had the wet T-shirt night?
They did in 1977, and I think they got something like 27,000 people out to the ballpark, and there were several rain delays during the game, but people hung in there because they wanted to check out the wet T-shirt contest.
Right.
So I talk in Big Hair and Plastic Grass. I talk about early in the 2000s, the Braves started having Faith Night, where players would come out and after the game and discuss their personal relationship with Jesus, and give me the wet T-shirt night any day of the week.
Hey man, what about 10-cent beer night?
10-cent beer night in Cleveland, absolutely notorious example of a baseball promotion gone very wrong. The Indians were having a lot of trouble drawing people to their ballpark, which was this, known as the Mistake on the Lake. It was this giant, cavernous, cold place, and the Indians were not a good team. So they thought, well, if we just sell beer, cups of Schlitz for 10 cents per, unlimited,
what could possibly go wrong?
So, and actually, I think, a lot of people were also getting stoned in the crowd that night, which was a fairly common occurrence at Major League ball games in the 70s. You'd go, and there would inevitably be a huge waft of, cloud of smoke moving through your section. But after a while, too many 10-cent beers, and the fans got a little obstreperous. And what happened was the Indians were playing the Rangers, and there had already been a fight between these two teams in Texas a week earlier. So some of the fans were spoiling for payback. And at one point, Jeff Burroughs, who was the Rangers' right fielder, went back to catch a ball and was tackled by a couple of fans who'd run out. There had been streakers running out of the field throughout the game, but this was the first moment where the players or the fans actually took it out on the players, and then it just went completely up for grabs. There's some great photos of the Rangers all like coming out of the dugout with their bats to do battle with the fans, and it was players from both teams versus the fans. So fans were wailing on Indians players who they'd been rooting for an inning earlier. And actually the Indians had planned to do several more of these promotions throughout the season, but after this the commissioner put a stop to the idea.
The end of the party, but not before we had Disco Demolition Night.
Well, and that's, if Altamont is kind of the end of the 60s, Disco Demolition Night is kind of the end of the 70s in a way. And this is Bill Veeck, the Chicago White Sox owner. He installed his son as head of promotions for the White Sox. And his son was, his late 20s, very into rock and roll. And there was a radio station in Chicago, WLUP, that had really kind of made hay out of the antagonism towards disco. I mean, disco music, had become so popular, that there was this kind of inevitable backlash, and various social critics now like to ascribe racist and homophobic motivations behind that backlash. But a lot of it, and there was some truth to that, but a lot of it really just came from that it was omnipresent, that you would look at the Billboard Top 40 and 30 of the songs had dance in the title.
It was everywhere.
It was everywhere. And, and it spilled into fashion, this sort of like people saw Saturday Night Fever, the film, and then wanted that to recreate that in their own lives. So it was really kind of omnipresent, and the kids who were wearing jeans and wearing denim and digging Zeppelin really kind of felt left out of the party. Mm-hmm. So this DJ at WLUP, Steve Dahl, had this whole disco sucks movement that he'd helped to kind of popularize in Chicago, and he'd done events and people would come to it. So Mike Veeck, Bill's son, thought, well, why don't we do something like this between games of a doubleheader at Comiskey? And again, Comiskey Park, they didn't have a lot of success drawing fans to the games. Terrible team. So the concept was you come to the game with a disco record, whether you bought it or stole it or took it out of your sister's collection or whatever, and and so you bring it and you get in for 98 cents, which was the 98 the call letters of the station. They didn't anticipate that, they expected maybe 30,000 people would show up Thursday night. They didn't expect that not only would it be a sellout crowd, but that tens of thousands more people would be outside without tickets just wanting to party. Yeah. And so after time, the ushers just stopped taking the records, because these records that they were taking from the fans, they were going to put them in a big pile on center field, blow them up between games. But they stopped taking the records from people, so people were just going to seats with their records, get wasted, throw it into the, onto the fields of Frisbee. All the players are, ducking these discs. Excuse me. And They did have the big event in between games where they blew up the records, but the fans kind of went nuts and invaded the field in celebration and tore it up to such an extent that the second game was forfeited because there was absolutely no way the White Sox and Tigers could play on the field after what these
such
kids
carnage.
did to it. Yeah. So, excuse me. What's interesting though is that the White Sox during the late 70s, would often have these series of concerts called the World Series of Rock. And they had one about a week after Disco Demolition where, had nothing to do with baseball at all. It was just that, the White Sox would be out of town and you'd get, Santana and Eddie Money and, Rick Derringer come and play on the field and people would show up and get baked. In fact, there was a fire during the 1976 season in the upper deck where somebody dropped a joint and, the wooden seats just went up on a hot day, and Jeff Beck kept playing and looking up at the, cloud of smoke billowing out of the right field stands or stands over third base actually. And so really more damage was done to the field during the World Series of Rock than during Disco Demolition. But that's a fact that was conveniently forgot in the hue and cry over the Disco Demolition promotion.
Well, also in your book, you mentioned, I believe, the Anaheim Angels, people dropped a bunch of weed after like a Who show or something down there. So next thing you know,
Anaheim Stadium was a huge venue for, I think the Who played there, Kiss played there in '76 as well. This is where big concerts would happen in Southern California, and so I think there was a Who show in March of '76, and just a few weeks later, actually probably less than a few weeks later, all of a sudden these strange plants started sprouting in the outfield, which was kids throwing away their seeds, and then with how ballparks have really intense ground crews where it's get out there with the manure and get out there with the water, and so all of a sudden the plants were growing like crazy, and the plants were impervious initially to the kind of weed killers that they're trying to put onto it. And of course, word got out that and this was before the season started, but word got out that pot plants were growing at the Big A, and so all of a sudden, the Big A's grounds crew got all these, people who were offering to help out. You need these cleared out? Well, volunteer. You don't even have to pay me, man. And that was, of course, discouraged.
That is brilliant. Well, in your first book, Big Hair and Plastic Grass, I mean, we both love the 70s. And one of the things that's most emblematic of the 70s
afros
is just epic afro. So let's talk about fros a little bit.
Well, the afro, of course, was it was a symbol of Black pride, and it was definitely it was the younger generation of Black kids who were wearing afros as the 60s and into the 70s, and you didn't really see it starting to take hold in the baseball world until about 72, 73, where before it was, you look at baseball cards of Black players in the 1960s, and they're very clean cut. Short hair, no facial hair. White players didn't have facial hair either. It was, that was considered very radical. And by the early 70s, you get guys like Oscar Gamble here who just, let it grow. And and it was a really kind of misunderstood thing. Like Oscar Gamble, you could not find a player who was more of a team player, just a good guy, mellow. But a lot of the older white journalists who covered the sport were really put off by his hairdo. Just thought that meant he was militant, that meant he hated white people, that he was going to be a troublemaker,
Black
all
Panther
this
or
stuff.
something.
Yeah, exactly. When it really was, it was just a fashion statement, a symbol of pride, and. When he joined the Yankees in 1976, George Steinbrenner and Billy Martin, they made him cut all that hair off. I think it took his cap size down from an 8 to a 7.5. And but luckily this baseball card was issued by Topps before that fateful haircut happened. And really, I think this is the greatest baseball card ever made. And
It's pretty cool.
You can find it on eBay for $1. It's not worth anything, but to me, on a sentimental level, it's worth a lot.
Well, didn't you say this particular baseball card as well is kind of got like some early pre-Photoshop work
Yes.
they did with it?
Well, and this was something that the Topps company would do, was that a lot of times they didn't have pictures of players in the New York uniforms of their the teams that they'd been traded to over the season. So they would have their art department kind of, Oscar had come over from the Cleveland Indians, so they had their art department cook up a Yankees uniform for him. And you can see, I mean, that Yankees logo looks like it's been drinking Ripple, and that cap is ridiculous. And the pinstripes are completely not even in any way, shape, or form.
It looks like Mark's a lot or something.
Yeah, exactly. And they did it on a dry erase board and then just left it. So I would love to find the photo, the pre-retouched photo of this. I would hang that in my house. I would hang this in my house.
It's pretty glorious. I mean, that is a massive throw. It's another exhibition of why the 70s were so boss. And but I have to say, in my opinion, the afro by which all others must be measured would be this man, Sib Hashian. Can we bring that slide up?
And I don't know if, and Sib Hashian, of course, was the drummer for Boston.
I think we're looking for that slide.
There we go. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So Sib Hashian is the drummer for Boston. I don't know if this could technically be considered an afro because Sib wasn't black; he was Armenian. But it was.
That's pretty majestic.
But it's however you slice it, whatever you want to ascribe it to. I mean, that is one funky '70s do. And look in general with the kerchief around the neck and the sleeveless T-shirt. And Boston released their debut record in the fall of 1976, and at the time, it became the best-selling debut ever, and really was very emblematic of where rock music was going.
Absolutely.
It was very well produced, guitar heavy but very smooth. And to me, I mean, the first Boston record is one of my top 10 records ever. It's not a hip record, but I think it's a just absolutely perfectly done
Screw
record.
hip.
Yeah, screw hip, and plus it just takes me back to my inner 10-year-old self. And I don't know, it's like oral, I don't
like
know.
a guilty pleasure or something?
Well, it's beyond guilty pleasure. I mean, it's like a drug. Like I hear it and it makes me happy. It's I'm not sure what drug you would ascribe that to, but it's it's just a sound that just resonates at a very core level for me.
I tend to agree, and that's part of what I wanted to talk about. It's just the fact that the 70s they cast such a long shadow across the cultural landscape even today, and I'm kind of jumping the gun, but this book, which is primarily about 76 and the bicentennial,
right.
If you want to make fun of the 70s, go ahead, but check this out. 1976. This is some of the albums that came out in 76. The first couple everybody associates with 76, but it gets better. Peter Frampton Comes Alive, probably the album of the year.
Yeah, huge.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Songs in the Key of Life, Stevie Wonder, Hotel California, record. Eagles, slipped in Under the Wire, I think
right.
came in December. Boston's first album, we mentioned it. The Ramones' first album. So you want to, if you want to bag on Boston, you had the Ramones.
And what's interesting, let me just interrupt you, is that the Ramones' first album, which is this incredibly lo-fi record, was made for about the same amount of money that Boston's was.
Really?
Because so much of Boston's record was made in Tom Scholl's home
right.
studio. So it was, and then they put about $3,000 worth of professional studio sweetening on top of it, and $3,000 is about what the Ramones record cost.
Interesting.
So it's like you have two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of musical approach and influence, but neither of them cost very much to make.
And they came out the same year. It gets even better because you got Aerosmith rocks, you got Queen, A Day at the Races. Kiss puts out 2 records, Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, Thin Lizzy puts out Jailbreak, Zeppelin puts out Presence, the Rolling Stones, Black and Blue, Wings at the Speed of Sound, UFO, No Heavy Petting, Jeff Beck, Wired, ELO, A New World record, and one of my favorites that I listen to a lot, Station to Station, David Bowie.
Absolutely, the Thin White Duke period.
It's like, I go back to that a lot. I mean, the 70s were funky, man, and they were deep, and the musicianship and the sports, these people were masters at their game at that time.
Well, and something else I talk about in Stars and Stripes is, you got the Ramones, you've got Boston, Frampton Comes Alive, but you also have really the beginnings of disco.
Yes.
And the Chic's first record wouldn't come out till 1977, but it was, but they were already going, and the disco scene that in New York was really happening on an underground level, and kind of a similar way to the way the CBGB scene was happening in New York, where it's like people who were part of it were way into it, they knew about it, but it hadn't really hit the mainstream yet. And there was actually a Nick Cohn article from New York Magazine that came out in the summer of '76 that the film Saturday Night Fever was eventually based on. But that article is really sort of ground zero of people's awareness, on a mainstream level of disco. And also Johnny Taylor's Disco Lady, which came out in the summer of '76, which has members of Funkadelic playing on it. But it's that was the first single to sell 2 million copies, I think. I mean, it was a huge hit in the summer of '76. So you have just so many of these musical movements, either morphing like rock was doing, or developing like punk and disco were doing. Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen, that comes out at the end of 1976. So it's such a fertile period, and I think people tend to think of the '70s as disco balls and glitter and all of this, but it was a lot deeper than that.
Well, we've got to throw something else in here, because '76 obviously was the bicentennial year, 1976, 1776. So amongst all the funkiness that was happening on the field and in the studios, there was also things like this. And you pointed out a bit of a questionable nature about this.
Well, first of all, let me just say that you could not go anywhere in 1976 without seeing some kind of logo, whether it was the official '76 logo, whether it was the Liberty Bell, whether it was, the old 13 colonies, stars and stripes. It was so much about, pride in the, 200th anniversary of the country. America's birthday, basically.
Yeah.
But it was also this like massive, the pride was very genuine, but it was also this massive over-marketing crassness.
I can't imagine.
And everybody wanted to get in on it. And so you got bicentennial everything from pop bottles to, there's a bicentennial edition of Playboy, a bicentennial edition of various Marvel comics. And you had bicentennial lunchboxes, which in this case, that's a rather questionable illustration. There's the father of our country checking out the posterior of the shoeshine boy. I didn't make it. I'm just pointing it out here.
Yeah.
That's
Well, let's move on to something less questionable, but very fabulous, which was the Cadillac Eldorado bicentennial. Now, this is a fat ride, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is a limited edition ride made by Cadillac in honor of the bicentennial, and you can't really see it, but there was a red interior to go with mostly white leather, but there's red and blue piping. It's really a stellar car. It also, I believe, was the last convertible that Cadillac would make for decades, and it was and this is sort of like right when Detroit is starting to make smaller cars to combat the popularity of the Japanese imports.
Well, if you couldn't afford the Cadillac Eldorado, you did have the choice of getting the Chevy Vega, which was also
here's a bicentennial edition of the Vega. Which
you know what? One of the better looking Vegas that I've seen.
Yeah, and although that's not really saying much,
right?
And also, of course, the other big it was the peak of its popularity in 1976 was the AMC Pacer, which was about as wide as that Cadillac that we just saw, and about as short as the Chevy Vega, and really just
one of the most unattractive cars ever.
Extremely unattractive. Although when I was 10, I wanted my dad to get us a Pacer so badly. I thought they were so cool, but they're really like it was riding in a fishbowl on wheels, and just poor design on so many levels, and I think Not that my father was going to take my advice as to what car he would get, but he got a Toyota Corolla instead, and I think was much happier.
Not a bad call. To wrap up, because I know we're going to have to get out of here, but the 70s, look, right now, everyone is abuzz about the remakes of Star Wars.
Right.
You know, AC/DC headlines Coachella. Rock radio is dominated by the 70s. You know, every generation will have their golden age that
Right.
they look at. What do you think it is about the 70s that is so magical and why we continue to look at it? Or is it just that guys like us who grew up in the 70s are here to celebrate it?
Well, I think it's both. I think for guys of our age, you know, that this is our golden age,
Yeah.
and we're now culturally in a position to go, this is the cool stuff. Check
Right.
this out. You know, I mean, that's what I'm doing with my books.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think there's something very unique about that period where it's not completely corporate. You know, I mean, there was certainly corporate influence in sports, in music, in film, what have you. But there was also something very raw about it and very human.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I think, you know, you look at a film like from 1976, like The Bad News Bears, you know, like that, the way that was, I mean, obviously a remake has been made of that, but it doesn't have the same edge that The Bad News Bears did. You know, a film like Taxi Driver, which came out in 1976. You know, even Rocky, which came out in late 76 and kind of, you know, spearheaded this move towards more feel-good American cinema. I mean, that's a very gritty film.
It's a great film.
And it's a great film. And so I think there's this grittiness in, you know, even in the more produced stuff that, you know, like I said, you know, like, again, back to the first Boston record, you know, it's very smooth, but it's very organic. It's like this was something that was done in this guy's basement, and he just figured out how to make these sounds and all this. He didn't have, you know, the auto-tune. He didn't have all of these. A Mac, right, all this stuff. So there's a human element to the stuff from the 70s, and with the players, with their kind of personal expression, whether it's the mustaches or the afros or just, you know, the way they behaved on and off the field, that, you know, everything is so more kind of smoothed over and compact and presented and sold to you in certain ways now. And I think that you know, that was, you know, as much as there were elements of that then, I think it was, you know, I don't want to say it was a purer time, because there were, you know, I mean, maybe the drugs were purer, but there were, you know, there were a lot of other, you know, complicated influences happening. But I think it's just so much more, you know, it's much more fun.
Much more fun. There's a bit of an outlaw element, which is always fun. And yeah, it was just good times. And of course, guys like us are nostalgic about it. Before we get out of here, I wanted to remind people, Stars and Strikes, Dan's most recent book. It's a blast. The previous book is Big Hair and Plastic Grass.
And Big Hair and Plastic Grass covers the entire decade, whereas Stars and Strikes is more of a deep dive into 1976, kind of a, you know, time machine, if you will.
I was just wondering, given our predilection and love for the 1970s, before we get out of here, would it be possible to get a little classic 76 Paul Stanley?
Well, Michael, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm not sure that I can do a Paul Stanley imitation for you. I could probably do a Gene Simmons if you like. Let me preface this by saying that I interviewed Gene once at a delicatessen, and
of course,
as one does. And as we sat down, he looks at me and goes, "This place is run by Satanists."
What?
And I said, "That's exactly what I said." And I said, "What?" And he pushes one of these dessert cards with pictures of various desserts that the deli has towards me, and he goes, "See what I mean? Satanists, I tell you." And I said, "Well, you know, Gene, those Danishes do look pretty good." He goes, "Jews and Danish, don't get me started."
I think that'll do. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Parker. This has been my buddy, Dan Epstein. I hope you'll pick up his books. This show is Antidote. If you like it, please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to The Lip TV and The Lip TV 2. Until next week, we're The Antidote. We're out.